Hello, my name is Gavin Pickering, and this is my submission to the ENCMP 100 programming contest. It is a randomly generated invisible maze. When you run the program, you're prompted for a number of rows and a number of columns, let's just say 30 by 30. The maze will then generate entirely based off of these two inputs with some randomness thrown in. Once the maze generates, you're told how to play the game. You can move around with the arrow keys or WASD, whatever you prefer. And if you decide you've had enough of the game, you can hit escape to stop it. The code itself is mostly within the scope of the course, with the two exceptions being changing the size of the matplotlib figure right here, as well as the keyboard listener that allows you to control movement with your keyboard rather than just console inputs. The code was written entirely by myself, and is inspired by a previous original project of mine. I want to talk a little bit about the inspiration behind this project. So this is an image of the original game I made back in 10th grade. This is another maze with next to no fake paths. It has a set path instead of randomly generated one, and the way I coded this was rather embarrassing. I basically just took every cell that was safe and put it into a giant if statement. So I had the clear goal going into this project that I wanted to just do much, much better. So let's get into the process of doing better. In the first couple days after thinking on my idea, I threw together this document. It's changed a little bit over the course of the project, but it's largely the same as when I first wrote it. It outlines 4 key things I want in the final project and divides them into multiple sections that allow me to set a goal for every time I sit down to code. I put, after the end of each section I finished, the date I finished it, and the version it's contained in. Now let's go take a look at version 1. In version 1, I focused on implementing more of the basic features. If I run the code real quick, you can see I'm still prompted for rows and columns, but only the grid and the initial and ending positions actually generate. I also implemented the keyboard listener at this point, but it doesn't actually move the player, it just types out the WASD equivalent of what you pressed. There's also an issue when I stop the keyboard listener that I had not figured out how to solve yet. It causes an error. In version 2, I focused on actually generating the main path. If I run the code, you can quickly see a problem with this. There's obviously a runtime issue. I tried to brute force generating the path to a set endpoint, which multiplied the amount of attempts it would take to actually generate the path by anywhere between like 1,000 and 1,000,000. So this very clearly will take a while to generate and is not very good. At this point, I can't show you because there's no actual path generated, but the player can actually move around the maze and is defined by the boundaries of the actual maze. Finally, in version 3, I focused on adding the fake paths around the main one. I also gave the maze its main gimmick, being its invisibility, and I also gave it a nice color scheme. But most importantly, I fixed the glaring runtime issue from version 2, where I was trying to generate a fixed path length to a fixed endpoint. I solved this by simply making the endpoint the end of the path that was generated instead of trying to force it to a certain point. I also want to address a couple of problems I ran into while coding this project. After version 2 with its runtime issues, I tried to convert the entire project in using NumPy instead of normal lists, thinking that would help the runtime. Instead of decreasing the runtime like I thought it would, it increased it astronomically. I have no idea why this is. Maybe I used NumPy wrong, but it didn't work for me. The other major issue I ran into was I had to use a lot of these global variables. This is because my keyboard listener is in a completely separate block than the rest of my functions. They can't communicate, and every time I move the character, I need to replot this graph to be able to show the current position. So those variables that get plotted need to be global so that I can use the plot function under the key press. Well, that's all I have for you. I hope you've enjoyed listening to me ramble on about my program. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.